Hello, I'm Dora Ching, the Associate Director of the P.Y. and Kim May W. Tong Center for East Asian Art at Princeton University, and I'm delighted to present this lecture, Visualizing Dunhuang, at Current Archaeology Live 2022. Thank you for joining me, and a big thank you to the editors of Current Archaeology, especially Lucia Marchini, for giving me the opportunity to present my work on the Mogao and Yulin caves at Dunhuang. From its earliest construction to the present, Dunhuang has been visualized in many ways, beginning with the planners, builders, and artists who made the caves from the 4th through the 14th century, and extending to the 20th century explorers, photographers, and conservators, and into the present as 21st century scholars continue research and artists continue to draw inspiration from the Buddhist caves. This image of the Mogao cliff in winter, composed of 4 collaged photographs, represents one way the site was visualized in 1943 and 44 by James and Lucy Lowe, the photographers who made an archive of nearly 3,000 negatives. We see the cliff in the background with a structure called the 9-story tower, an ice-filled river that runs in front of the cliff, and mountains visible in the distance. The Lowes made another panorama. The top register shows, also in 4 collaged photographs, the Mogao cliff in the far distance, almost dwarfed in a landscape dominated by sand. What the Lowes chose to photograph and how they frame their images represent how they visualized Dunhuang in the 1940s. But first, what is Dunhuang and where is it? I'm going to turn off my camera now so the focus will be on the images. I'll turn it back on at the end of the lecture. In this modern photograph, we see the cave site in the distance in a dramatic landscape dominated by mountain ranges and desert in full color, the various shades of tan, orange, or brown of the sand, the green of the trees in front of the cliff, and the blue sky beyond the mountains. In this lecture, I will first give an introduction to Dunhuang and then discuss how studying the Lowe archive of black and white photographs from the 1940s can enrich our understanding of the Buddhist caves. What is Dunhuang? Strictly speaking, Dunhuang is the name of the city 25 kilometers northwest of the cave site. Today, however, the term Dunhuang is often used to describe a cluster of caves near the city, the largest of which is called the Mogao Caves. It has also been called Caves of the Thousand Buddhas. Where is Dunhuang? This is a screen capture from Google Earth. The yellow arrow points to the Mogao Caves. As easily seen in this topographical map, the cave site is flanked by deserts, the Gobi to the east and north, and the Taklamakan to the west. The waters from the snow-capped mountains to the south nourish the area. Dunhuang is strategically located at the convergence of the ancient northern and southern trade routes on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert in northwestern China, and served as a gateway and nexus for trade between China and Central Asia. West of Dunhuang, trade routes extended to Kashgar and the Pamirs, and then further west toward Central Asia and Persia, north toward the Russian steppe, south toward India, and east of Dunhuang, routes led to China and the ancient capital Chang'an, which is present-day Xi'an. The dotted lines represent the various trade routes, often called the Silk Road or Silk Roads, which linked peoples from India across Central Asia and into China and beyond. Because Dunhuang was at the crossroads, it became a vibrant center for trade and religious expression. The Mogao cliff, seen from a distance, stretches about 1.6 kilometers running north to south. It is divided into 2 sections. The northern section has around 200 caves that were mostly undecorated and served as living meditation and even on rare occasion, burial chambers. The southern section, a diagram is at top, has close to 500 caves decorated with painting and sculpture. The period of active construction at the Mogao cave spanned 1,000 years from the 4th to the 14th century. All told, the decorated caves contain about 45,000 square meters of painting and over 2,000 sculptures. The sculptures and murals, along with portable paintings and manuscripts found in the caves, represent practically every doctrinal and artistic aspect of Buddhism. Dunhuang is one of the richest Buddhist sites and collections of what we call Buddhist art. Of course, while it was being constructed, the builders, craftsmen, artists, and patrons did not call the work art. They were making devotional spaces filled with religious icons and depictions of religious texts and stories. I'm going to touch upon a few themes and show a few caves and murals to give you a sense of what one can study or see. There is, of course, far more than a lifetime's worth of topics to study at Dunhuang. First, back to the 9-story tower. And here we see an aerial view of the cliff with a 9-story tower. One can get a sense of the space, the height of the tower. Photographed from ground level, it becomes immediately apparent that the 9-story tower literally towers above the tree line at left. At right is a view of the northern section of the Mogao cliff, the section of caves that are undecorated. In this photo, we see the cliff, its sandiness, the cave openings, and the mostly dry riverbed with a high retaining wall. During the spring, the snow melt from the nearby mountains floods this riverbed, as do sudden, unexpected downpours, which have become more common during modern times of extreme climate change. Imagine raging water flooding this area and threatening to overwhelm the barriers. These two photos show the 9-story tower and what the Mogao caves look like today. Depending on the season, one might see hordes of people or just one person, as in the photo on the right. Note how the facade of the caves at right show the stabilization materials that blend with the color of the natural cliff face. All caves are numbered, mostly above the entrances, which are secured by metal doors. Exterior walls, access stairways, and safety railings protect both the visitors and the caves. Given the harsh desert climate, these elements are in constant need of repair. Take a look inside, and here I point out two themes: cave architecture and sculpture. We will see a number of different cave types, and this happens to be a colossal Buddha cave, which is not a very common type. It takes up the entire height of the cliff, requiring huge amounts of cliff space, and the planning, the coordination of builders, sculptors, paintings, and immense funding is required to mount such an excavation and such a construction. In Cave 96, the 9-story tower, a colossal Buddha occupies the entire space. In terms of sculpting technique, most smaller scale sculptures were made with a core or armature of straw or other vegetable material surrounded by layers of clay, with the finest, smoothest layer on the surface. Colossal Buddhas, however, had a stone core which was then augmented with clay and sculpted to its finished state. Cave 96 was constructed under the order of Empress Wu Zetian and completed around 697. We don't have time to dwell too much on questions that such a cave with a colossal Buddha would raise, but let's just pose a few. What would such a cave have costed? What social structures would have supported such large-scale construction? Who were the artisans who made and painted the sculpture? What kind of models or artistic practices did they have? These are but a few questions that serve to demonstrate how a single cave can engender a wealth of research projects. Let's move on, though. Continuing with the theme of cave architecture, Cave 285 is an interesting case study, dated 538 and 539 through an inscription. Cave 285 is unusual because of its structure and decorative program. The Mogao cliff runs north to south and all caves face east, so upon entering a cave, one would be looking directly at the west wall. The diagram at left shows a central squarish hall with 3 main niches in the west wall and many smaller niches in the south and north walls. The photograph at right shows a view of the west wall, the south and north walls, and 3 slopes of the ceiling. The cave architecture alone, with the many niches, deserves greater inspection. Similarly, the decorative program shows lots of interesting details. There is a mix of deities, some of Hindu origin, some native Chinese mythical figures, many Buddhist stories and Buddha groups, and donor figures with inscriptions. Clearly, this cave deserves a full-scale lecture in and of itself, but that's for another occasion. I'd like to turn now to a different topic, a type of painting found throughout the Mogao caves, murals of narrative illustration. Here we see a detail from the Jataka of the 9-colored deer in Mogao Cave 257. How are stories told visually? What kind of painting techniques and motifs are used? In this example, the story unfolds left to right in diagonal space cells. This is a tale about gratitude and honesty versus greed and treachery. The 9-colored deer saves a man from drowning. He asks the man not to divulge his whereabouts. The man, however, hears that the king's wife wants the 9-colored deer pelt and antlers, and the king will give a reward to anyone who knows where the deer is. Giving into greed, the man tells the king. Just as the 9-colored deer is going to be captured, he speaks with the king and recounts the story. The king is moved by the story and forbids everyone to hunt the deer. The narrative is conveyed through multiple scenes, and the deer appears several times. This is a common strategy, but by no means the only one. The protagonists are large, and the landscape elements are more like props. Such narratives and varied painting strategies abound at the Mogao caves and provide an endless supply of material to research. The murals furthermore provide a wealth of material for the study of painting and painting history. My introduction to Dunhuang was through this image in a graduate seminar on Chinese painting style. This running bull, seemingly conjured up out of kinesthetic brush lines alone, became an iconic image about creating form and conveying movement with a few brushstrokes. Imagine my surprise when I finally went to Dunhuang and had the good fortune to see Cave 249 and saw that the running bull was but a small detail on the slope of the north ceiling in a cave painted floor to ceiling, here in this yellow box. My perception of the caves at Dunhuang changed forever at that moment. So to recap, I'm showing you 7 images, each of which represent far more. For studying cave architecture and decorative programs, one has only to select a cave, such as Cave 249 or any other cave for that matter. And we see Cave 249 in a yellow box. One can study the sculpture, and here are 2 examples in yellow boxes. There are over 2,000 sculptures at the Mogao caves, and one can study iconography, style, changes in development in style, and different kinds of visual features and techniques. Or, like the Jataka of the 9-colored deer, one could focus on Buddhist narratives and ask questions such as how are stories told visually? What stories were favored during what time periods? And many other questions. Because caves are dated or datable, the cave contents, sculpture and painting, can provide securely dated works for comparison to other paintings. For instance, scholars have studied the detail in the yellow box at far left to understand illusionism in painting. The bodhisattvas, the Buddha's helpers who have attained enlightenment but have decided to stay in the world of sentient beings to help, look like they are leaning over a balustrade. Interestingly, they are both painted to create such an illusion, and they are actually painted on the curved ceiling of the niche. So they are in fact also looking down by virtue of their position. Such illusionism is quite advanced for the early Tang, which is the 7th century. And on the upper right, I have boxed the running bull again. Not surprisingly, many of the murals at Dunhuang depict Buddhist religious texts. This is a detail from the Sutra on the Contemplation of the Buddha of Immeasurable Life on the north wall of Cave 217. Countless sutra paintings, sometimes called tableaus, grace the walls of caves. They can be analyzed for their content and painting style, as well as many other questions, such as why some sutras are more popular during certain time periods, or how the depiction of a particular sutra changes over time. I hope these few images give you a sense of the variety and overwhelming visual material at Dunhuang. And apart from looking at in situ sculpture and painting, as well as the physical spaces of caves, we can also study an equally overwhelming cache of material. Paintings, textiles, sutra scrolls, manuscripts, both whole and fragmented, all from one cave known as the Library Cave, Mogao Cave 17. At lower left, we see a photo of the bundles of paintings and manuscripts that were discovered in the early 1900s. At some time around the year 1000, A small cave which served as a repository of thousands of paintings, manuscripts, and manuscript fragments and textiles was sealed. In the early 1900s, the self-appointed caretaker at the site discovered the cache and sold off much of it to explorers and sinologists, foremost among them Sir Orlstein and Paul Pelliot. Much of the material was collected at the British Museum, the British Library, the Musée Guimet, and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Items include design sketches, such as these, or texts in a plethora of languages, such as Chinese at top left, Tangut in the center, Hebrew at right, and Tibetan or Zanzun script at lower left. Texts or fragments in many other languages, such as Sanskrit, Sogdian, and Old Burmese, among others, were discovered, and linguists have had a field day with these texts. Also found in the library cave were many silk banners and paintings like the one at left, which is one of the few depictions of the Buddha of blazing light and the 5 planets, dated 897. At right is the printed frontispiece to the Diamond Sutra, dated 868, the earliest printed book known. Clearly, the Mogao caves, with 1,000 years of activity, construction of the caves, and the production of sculptures, paintings, and manuscripts, is an incredibly rich site. I want to return now to the low archive photographs of the 1940s. Both panoramas represent the Low's vision of the Mogao cliff site in 1943 and 44, captured in black and white. We just looked at a lot of images in color, and one might ask, why would one study an archive of black and white photographs when we have modern photography in color, and even digital or virtual caves? I will show a selection of low archive photos to demonstrate the archive's uniqueness and value. The Low Archive, a collection of around 3,000 photographs held at Princeton University, represents a now vanished historical perspective on these significant monuments. From the viewpoint of documentation and conservation, the photographs preserve historical views of the cave's exteriors and interiors, many of which are now irretrievably changed. From an aesthetic perspective, they offer unusual artistic images created by a photographer deeply steeped in and well-versed in art photography. Let's take a moment to settle into this monochromatic world and travel back in time to the 1940s. I will show photos that underscore the importance of the archive and will highlight these features. The archive as a time capsule, preserving views now lost forever, as documentation of historical events or events of human interest, as records of cave architecture and paintings, and therefore essential for conservation efforts in art historical study, and finally as art photography, especially James Lowe's images with unusual perspectives and angles, inventive use of light and shadow, and his ability to capture three-dimensionality of the caves. So who were the Lows? In 1943, fueled by a desire to photograph the caves and encouraged by professional colleagues and personal friends, James Lowe and Lucy Lowe traveled to Dunhuang and spent 18 months systematically photographing exteriors and interiors of the Mogao and Yulin caves. James, the head of the photographic department at the Central News Agency, applied successfully for a year-long leave of absence so that he could travel to Dunwon and carry out his photographic project. Lucy was also a staff photographer. Before they left Chongqing, they made careful preparations, purchasing as much film stock as they could, along with chemicals and other supplies. They used black and white film, which they could develop on site. Traveling from Chongqing to Dunhuang with another Central News Agency photographer, Gu Tingpeng, they took all modes of transportation, including vehicles such as the one pictured here. They eventually switched to wagon and even horseback, and the arid landscape would have been what they encountered when they arrived. And now for some low archive images. This is an example of a view lost forever. Stupas dot the landscape with the Mogao cliff in the distance. In the far distance, we can see the cliff and even some caves in the northern section. Such a view no longer exists, and many of these stupas may have been moved or may have suffered damage. Although most of the Low photographs are of caves, occasionally they photograph people engaged in archaeological activities. Just after the Dunhuang Art Institute, now the Dunhuang Academy, was founded, we see archaeologists excavating items from the stupa at left. And at right, we see archaeologists and scholars explore the northern caves. This photograph, which also happens to be my favorite virtual background, shows the outside of the Mogao caves as they were in the 1940s. The cave fronts have fallen away, revealing the antechambers and exposing the caves to the elements. Such photos are important for historians, conservationists, and architects. These two photographs are invaluable for a number of reasons. First, they show the relationship among caves. At left, we see how a number of caves are next to one another, because we can see through 5 caves. We are actually, if you look at the diagram, standing at far left. This first cave here is in black on the diagram, and then we see through these successive spaces until we see to the far wall at the back, which happens to be the cave depicted in the photo at the right. At right, we see into the next cave adjacent to this cave. Second, these views no longer exist. The perforations in the walls have been sealed up. They had been made in the early 1900s by the self-appointed caretaker, since there were no exterior walkways. He simply tunneled through the caves to get from one to another. Third, the photos capture a sense of space that emphasizes 3-dimensionality. See, for instance, the frontal shot of Cave 272 at lower right, which I showed earlier. The modern photograph has color, but it does not convey 3-dimensionality or the textures of the walls. And lastly, the photos show how James Lowe captured the light and capitalizes on the contrast between light and shadow in painted areas and areas of jagged wall. In comparison to photographs from other expeditions, the Lowe archive is the most comprehensive. It was the first time that anyone systematically photographed the caves. When James Lowe arrived at the cave site, he spent a week surveying the site and planning how to photograph it and how to allocate his limited film stock. I show an example of just one section of Mogao Cave 61, the corridor, which is this area here, and Cave 62, which is the top part of this image at right. The two photos at left here are in the corridor, and here I show them boxed in yellow. Compared to the 3 other major expeditions to the cave site, the Lowe photographs are clearly the most comprehensive, and I'm only showing 3 Lowe photos here. There are many, many more of this cave. The photos from the Stein, Peleo, and Oldenburg expeditions are self-explanatory, and they number very few compared to the Lowe archive photos. The Lowe photos have also been used and will continue to be used for conservation purposes, and especially for international collaborative projects. The Getty Research Institute has partnered with the Dunhuang Foundation for decades, and Cave 85, pictured here, showcases years of conservation efforts. In the Lowe photos, we see the crumbly rock of the ceiling where sheets of paint have fallen away. At right is a wide-angle photograph of the cave after conservation. The areas of loss in the ceiling have been stabilized. To give you a sense of some of the challenges, at left is a section of the wall where the paint is either peeling off or is flaked or cracked off completely. In light of all the environmental dangers faced by the site today, the historical photographs in the Lowe archive are even more important as the site continues to face natural threats, from earthquake, wind erosion, flood, and high levels of salt in the walls themselves. For the art historian, the Lowe photos are indispensable. Compare, for instance, the Lowe photo on the left with a modern photo on the right. Art historians surmise that 4 more bodhisattvas had been painted behind the Buddha. However, they could not be sure until they saw the Lowe photo. Lowe photos have been used to verify educated conjectures and help answer vexing research questions. Finally, I will show 3 series of images that reveal the aesthetic nature of James Lowe's photography. Some images fall into many categories, such as this one, which shows the architecture of a central pillar cave. Here we can see the central pillar, and the way one would have visited this cave is we would enter and circumambulate it clockwise. So this photo shows cave architecture, and it could also aid conservation efforts. But more importantly, it demonstrates James Lowe's aesthetic vision. We have a view of the cave taken from below. We see the roughness of the walls, which have broken away, and the thickness in this area. And we clearly see the Buddha in the niche on the front of the central pillar here. Compare the photograph at left, taken in 1907 during Orlstein's expedition. This photo shows cave 251 here, but also a small shallow cave to the left, and a deeper cave, cave 249, the one with the running bull. In terms of documenting the cliff face, the Stein photograph contains more information about a larger section of the cliff. However, I would argue that the Lowe photograph possesses a kind of immediacy, as though beckoning us to try to enter the cave. We see the seated Buddha clearly here in the center, and we see partially bathed in brilliant sunshine the painted Buddha on the north wall here. And if this is not enough, James Lowe takes us into the cave and gives us another view looking out. So on the right, we are below, we are on the outside looking up and into the cave. And on the left, we are now inside the cave at the rear looking out. Notice the jagged edge of the wall and the two views of the bodhisattvas on the central pillar. These are actually the same bodhisattvas. These clues anchor us in space, so we can reconstruct the space like a 3D puzzle. The second series of images is from cave 328. The photo shows the west wall Buddha niche with the Buddha seated, flanked by sculpted monks and bodhisattvas along with painted ones. The frontal view of the main Buddha group feels very much like documentary photography. However, James Lowe took a series of very different images. He trained his lens on the seated and kneeling bodhisattva along the north wall of the niche, but he didn't just stop with one photo. He varied the angle and even captured a sliver of the kneeling bodhisattva that is outside the niche. Look here at the very edge. Again, he changed his position and the camera angle, and we see three bodhisattvas, their heads tilted gracefully down as though in motion. The bodhisattva farthest away holding his hands in prayer. But that is not all. Included in the lower left-hand corner of the frame is the hand of the Buddha. James Lowe made a photograph of what the Buddha literally sees and has privileged us with this view. Such sequences were not one-offs. Time and again, James Lowe created unique compositions capturing aesthetic forms in inventive ways. Look, for instance, at this bodhisattva, silhouetted against a wall painted with a paradise scene. James Lowe selected an f-stop so that the depth of field was quite deep, making the entire wall all the way to the corner at the far right of the composition readable. In fact, this bodhisattva is not even standing against this wall, but is actually standing inside the Buddha niche on the west wall. We get a very different sense of the bodhisattva in this frontal view. To conclude, this last series of images further demonstrates the play of layering and the creation of intriguing visual images. We see a dramatic image of a cave, actually two caves, exposed to the outside because part of the cliff fell away here. I should say actually parts of the cliff fell away. I show you the image of the Buddha which sits at the very edge of the cliff. And this is another image of the same cave, but it's vastly different. Both images play with layering. On the left at the bottom, we see the floor of the cave crumbled away, and we see the dramatic diagonal break of the cave wall here. On the right, we no longer see the cave floor, and our focus is drawn toward the rows of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in niches. Upon closer inspection, we see the fragmentary nature of the cave walls. We see the north wall of cave 257, the faded paint of the Buddha image juxtaposed with a ragged, thick cross-section of the walls. And then as we start to decipher the depth of cave 259, we might just wonder, how wide is that cave and how deep does it go? These are all views that have since vanished, but more than merely documenting these caves as they were, these images are about lyrical forms, complex viewing, and layering. And we have to thank James and Lucy Lowe, pictured here in the antechamber of Cave 85, for their extraordinary photographic expedition, their vision, and their curation of the negatives and photographs in the many decades after their stay in Dunhuang. They were the first to create a comprehensive photo archive of the Mogao and Yulin cave sites. They were neither specialists in Buddhist art nor experts in Buddhism, but they captured the most representative features of the caves, and they made images of grace and beauty, objects of value in and of themselves. I'm turning my camera back on now. Thank you for listening. I have two final slides. First, I've talked at length about the Lowe Archive photographs, and I would be remiss not to mention that Princeton University Press and the Tong Center for East Asian Art at Princeton University released in 2021 a monumental 9-volume publication titled Visualizing Dunhuang, the Lowe Archive Photographs of the Mogao and Yulin Caves. The publication provides a well-researched, accurate depiction of the Mogao and Yulin Caves as they were in the mid-1940s, and it celebrates the Lowe Archive as a collection of photographs with its own internal logic. The 9th volume of essays was published separately as a paperback and is filled with many Lowe Archive photographs. And lastly, thank you again. I leave you with a photo of the reclining Buddha in cave 158, a graceful and peaceful image, one worthy of contemplation and one to inspire different ways of seeing and studying the place we call Dunwon. Thank you.